In 1976, the man who supposedly inspired the Oscar statuette shot a campesino twice in the chest. His name was Emilio Fernández, El Indio. He was 72 years old. He fled to Guatemala like a fugitive, and 5 months later he was free. The man who invented Mexico on film. And what you're about to hear today is the story nobody has told in full until now. Today you're going to find out what his own daughter had to do with her father's lovers when she was only 12 years old. The exact words she used to describe him. You're going to hear the recording where Chavela Vargas tells the moment he pointed a gun at her, and the chilling reason the butler told her he couldn't give her a weapon. You're going to understand why his daughter Jacaranda fell from a third floor at 24, and why her mother never accepted that it was suicide 36 years, carrying that doubt. You're going to meet the Spanish actor he nearly killed with gunfire at the Churubusco studios, and who had to physically step in to save his life. And you're going to see how the genius who won the Palme d'Or at Cannes and had dinner with Marilyn Monroe ended up deliriously insisting that wasn't his house. His last words before he died. I'll tell you when each part arrives, but first you need to understand who this man was. Because if you don't understand his greatness, you won't understand the size of his fall. And believe me, the fall was brutal. Emilio Fernández was born on March 26, 1904, in a town in Coahuila, so small it doesn't even show up on a lot of maps. Mineral del Hondo, a place where the land was dry and the opportunities were even drier. His father was Emilio Fernández Garza, a revolutionary Colonel Hard, forged in the violence of a country bleeding itself out. His mother was Sarah Romo, descended from the Kickapoo people. From her, he inherited the features that would make him famous. High cheekbones, a square jaw, a gaze that looked like it could punch through walls. At 6 years old, little Emilio watched his father ride off to the Mexican Revolution. He saw him mount his horse, he saw him vanish into the horizon, and in that moment something inside him either broke or lit on fire. Maybe both. At 12, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He left school and joined the revolution. A 12-year-old kid among soldiers, among rifles, among men who killed and died like it was the most natural thing in the world. Decades later, he admitted it in an interview. The revolution made me a man. That's where I learned to read and where I discovered brothels. He was 12 when he discovered brothels. He grew up between battles, dust and blood, between a death that arrived without warning and left bodies scattered on the ground. Emilio himself put it this way: I grew up in the dust clouds of battle, where you die easily. The revolution taught him a lot: how to ride, how to shoot, how not to trust anyone, how to survive. But it also taught him something else: that violence was a tool, that problems were solved with fists, bullets, intimidation. He never forgot that lesson. In 1919, at 15, he became a formal soldier. A year later, he entered the military academy. It looked like he'd follow his father's path, become an officer, maybe even a general. But Emilio Fernández wasn't the kind of man who accepted orders. In 1923, he was expelled from the academy. Immediately, he joined Adolfo de la Huerta's uprising against Álvaro Obregón's government. The rebellion failed. Emilio was captured, sentenced to 20 years in prison. He was 19 years old. 20 years locked up, his whole youth wasted behind bars. Any other man would have accepted his fate, counted days, aged in a cell. But Emilio Fernández was not any other man. He escaped prison. Nobody knows exactly how. The versions change. Even he told different stories depending on who asked. That was his nature mix reality and legend until nobody could tell them apart. What we do know is this: he fled to the United States. First Chicago. He did whatever work he could find: dishwashing, hauling, anything. He survived. Then he went to Los Angeles, and that's where his life changed forever. Because in Los Angeles, there was Hollywood. El Indio got a job near the studios, working as a laborer carrying rocks, mixing cement under the California sun, while, just a few meters away, the movies the whole world watched were being made. Legend says his sculpted body drew attention: athletic, muscular, a physical presence that hypnotized people. He stopped hauling stones and started appearing in films as an extra, as a shadow, one more among hundreds of Mexicans looking for a second on screen, a dollar, a chance. But something set him apart. Not just his body, his ambition, his absolute conviction that he was meant for something bigger. And here comes one of the most famous legends in Mexican cinema, a story El Indio repeated his entire life, a story that tied him directly to the most coveted prize in the world. In those years, the most famous Mexican actress in Hollywood was Dolores Del Rio, an impossible beauty, a star brighter than the rest. Dolores was married to Cedric Gibbons, the art director at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, a powerful man in the industry. At the end of the 1920s, Gibbons was asked to design the trophy for the new Academy Awards. He needed a model, someone with a perfect body to inspire the statuette. According to the legend, Dolores Del Rio suggested her countryman. "Use Emilio," she told him. "He has the perfect body." And Emilio agreed. They say he posed nude for George Stanley, the sculptor who created the statuette. That his athletic figure, his proportions, became the Oscar. The Academy never confirmed it. Officially, the model's identity remains a mystery. But El Indio repeated it his whole life: interviews, parties, anyone who would listen. And in Mexico, the story became truth. Maybe you know that feeling when a story gets repeated so many times, it stops mattering whether it's real. It becomes bigger than the facts. It becomes myth. And myths have their own kind of truth. Emilio knew it. Decades later, he said a line that sums him up. "Idiots invent lies. Geniuses invent myths." He considered himself a genius. In the 1930s, he returned to Mexico. Time had erased his youthful crimes. Nobody was looking for him anymore. Nobody remembered the young rebel who escaped prison. But he brought something nobody else had. He'd seen how Hollywood worked. He'd been around the studios. He'd watched the great directors. He'd learned. His first starring role came in 1934 in a film called Janitzio, the story of an indigenous fisherman, noble and tragic, who dies defending his honor. The public loved him. Those indigenous features he'd inherited from his mother, features that in Hollywood got him shoved into villain roles or background parts. In Mexico, turned him into the embodiment of national identity. But acting wasn't enough. He wanted to create. He wanted to invent. He wanted to build a Mexico the entire world would admire. In 1941, he debuted as a director with La Isla de la Pasión, a film about Mexican soldiers defending a Pacific island. Modest success, but it opened doors. And El Indio wanted more. He didn't want to be just an actor. He didn't want to perform someone else's vision. He wanted to create his own. He started writing scripts, studying story structure, watching directors he worked with. Fernando de Fuentes hired him for Allá en el Rancho Grande, the film that launched the Mexican ranchera comedy. El Indio wasn't on screen much, but his feet are the ones doing the Yaraba Tapatio stomp in one of the film's most famous scenes. He was learning, absorbing, waiting. In 1941, a friend, actor David Silva, convinced the general-turned-producer to give El Indio a chance to direct. 50,000 pesos. That's what it cost to finance La Isla de la Pasión. At the time, El Indio lived in a garage in the Condesa neighborhood. No money, no powerful contacts, just ambition. The film did well enough to crack the door open. And then 1943 arrived. Maria Candelaria, the movie that changed everything. A story about an indigenous woman rejected by her community because her mother had posed nude for a painter. A story of love, discrimination, tragedy. Dolores Del Rio starred the same woman who supposedly introduced him as Oscar model, the same woman he had been hopelessly in love with since the first time he saw her in Hollywood. Decades later, he admitted it with no shame. "She looked at me without seeing me. I fell in love with her, but she ignored me. I adored her, truly, I adored her." An unreturned love that lasted his whole life. They filmed in Xochimilco. Gabriel Figueroa, the most important cinematographer in Mexico, created images that looked like paintings, dramatic clouds, silhouettes cut against the sky, an aesthetic that would define Mexican cinema for decades. In 1946, Maria Candelaria went to the Cannes Film Festival and won the Palme d'Or. El Indio Fernández became the first Latin American to win the most prestigious prize in European cinema. International press celebrated him. French critics compared him to great Russian masters. Sergei Eisenstein had filmed parts of Que Viva Mexico in the 1930s, and many people saw El Indio as his aesthetic heir. Suddenly, the child soldier who escaped prison was on top of the world. French critic Georges Sardou called his work the authentic portrait of rural Mexican life. Others compared him to John Ford, the master of the American Western. Hollywood wanted him, Europe admired him, and El Indio believed every word of it. With an ego too big for any room, he declared without a gram of irony, "There is only one Mexico, the one I invented. I am Mexican cinema." It wasn't false modesty, he genuinely believed it. And in a way, he was right. The images he created with Gabriel Figueroa shaped how the world saw Mexico. Proud charros, braided women, agave plants sliced against dramatic skies, colonial haciendas, mariachi music, melodrama before telenovelas even existed. Mexico didn't recognize itself in a mirror. It recognized itself on screen in the screen El Indio created. After Cannes came more successes. Every year, sometimes 2 or 3 times a year, El Indio released another masterpiece. Enamorada with Maria Felix, the story of a proud woman who falls for the revolutionary general occupying her town. Maria Felix and El Indio clashed constantly during filming two monumental egos on one set, but the result became one of the best films either of them ever made. La Perla, based on a story by John Steinbeck. The American writer collaborated on the script. A fisherman finds a giant pearl, and that wealth destroys his life. It won awards for cinematography at the Golden Globes and at the Venice Film Festival. Rio Escondido, where Maria Felix plays a rural teacher sent by the president to educate a town controlled by a local strongman. Government propaganda disguised as art, some said. A revolutionary nationalist masterpiece, others said. Pueblerina, the story of a woman raped by the local boss's son and her fight for justice. Columba Dominguez in the lead, one of the rawest, most powerful films in Mexican cinema. Salon Mexico, a radical shift. No more fields, no more indigenous villages. This time El Indio filmed the city. A dance hall, prostitutes, corrupt cops, urban tragedy. He proved he could do more than rural melodramas. Víctimas del Pecado with Ninon Sevilla Rumberas, cabarets, babies abandoned in trash cans. The dark side of Mexico City nobody wanted to see. He worked nonstop. 2, 3 films a year, each one more ambitious than the last. His team was almost always the same. Gabriel Figueroa on cinematography, Mauricio Magdaleno on the script. Together they created an unmistakable style. Figueroa's clouds became famous dramatic, threatening clouds that looked like they were predicting tragedy. Years later, Spanish director Luis Buñuel would work with Figueroa and ask him specifically not to shoot those clouds. He was tired of them, but El Indio loved them. And while all that was happening, he built his fortress literally. In 1946, the same year he won Cannes, he began constructing a mansion in Coyoacán. Architect Manuel Parra designed it, but the concept was all Emilio. He called it La Fortaleza, the fortress. And the name wasn't accidental. It was a mass of volcanic stone with walls thick like a medieval castle, towers, inner courtyards, a pond with ducks. Everything a man with delusions of grandeur could want. He lived there the rest of his life. He filmed more than 140 films there. He hosted the greatest names in the world. Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo walked those hallways. Jose Alfredo Jimenez wrote songs in his living room. Cuco Sanchez played guitar under those stone arches. Maria Felix ate dinner in his dining room. Maria Callas sang for him. Elizabeth Taylor admired his gardens. And Dolores del Rio never stopped visiting. Even though El Indio married other women, even though he had children with other women, Dolores was always there, always present, always close. And then in February, someone arrived that nobody expected. Marilyn Monroe, the most famous actress in the world, was in Mexico. Officially, she'd come to buy furniture and Mexican art for her new house in Brentwood, California. Unofficially, rumors said she was having an affair with Mexican actor José Bolaños. Marilyn visited the Churubusco studios where Luis Buñuel was filming The Exterminating Angel. She met Mexican stars, tried the food at a taqueria, ate little tacos. She even ate carnitas and maguey worms. Gabriel Figueroa, who was on Buñuel's set, told her a sentence that changed everything. "You have to see my buddy's house." That night, Marilyn Monroe arrived at the fortress. El Indio, always the showman, threw a private party. He didn't want the press to find out, just them, a trusted photographer, and Columba Dominguez. The house impressed Marilyn. The volcanic stone, the colonial arches, the rustic carved wood furniture. It was exactly the kind of atmosphere she wanted for her own home. El Indio showed her every corner, told her the story behind every object. He talked about Diego Rivera, who had helped design some of the sets. He showed her the view from the balcony facing Dulce Olivia Street, and then he taught her how to drink tequila the Mexican way. Salt on the back of your hand, lime, a shot glass in one gulp. Marilyn didn't get it. Too complicated. She tried once and almost choked. Twice and spilled half of it. 3 times, 4 times, 5, until she was completely drunk. She slept at the fortress that night. Knowing how much Marilyn loved Mexican furniture, El Indio gave her a gift. 2 mahogany dressers, hand-carved by artisans from Michoacan. Unique pieces. Beautiful. Marilyn took them to her house in Brentwood. 6 months later, August 5th, 1962, Marilyn Monroe was found dead in that same house. Those dressers were in her bedroom when they found her. There's a photo from that night at the fortress. Marilyn smiling, a Mexican rebozo over her shoulders. El Indio beside her, proud. Columba watching from behind 3 people who couldn't imagine what the future had waiting for them. The fortress was the center of Mexico's cultural universe. More than 140 films and telenovelas were shot there. El Rapto, Jorge Negrete's last film. El Libro de Piedra, a horror movie that still scares people. Corazón Salvaje, the telenovela that defined the genre. But the fortress was also a prison of volcanic stone, where appearances were everything, and reality hid behind thick walls. And this is where the story gets uncomfortable. In 1941, the same year he debuted as a director, El Indio traveled to Cuba. There he met a dancer named Gladys Fernández. She was 16. They married quickly. A year later, their first daughter was born, Adela. The marriage was a disaster from the start. El Indio accused her of being flirtatious, unfaithful. He was jealous with a sick intensity. Gladys couldn't take it. She abandoned her newborn daughter and went back to Cuba. According to Adela, her mother ran because she couldn't stand watching Emilio in love with another woman. Dolores del Rio, always Dolores del Rio. El Indio's impossible love. The woman he adored but never officially had, because there's a secret Adela revealed decades later, a secret everyone knew, but nobody said out loud. Dolores and El Indio were lovers. Adela described it in words that leave no room for doubt. They saw each other often. They spoke formally, using usted. No one could say it out loud, they're lovers. But everyone knew, and everyone stayed quiet. Even in intimacy, they used usted. It was a way to keep appearances, to pretend they were only colleagues, friends, artistic collaborators. But everyone who spent time at the fortress knew. Dolores would arrive alone, stay for hours, sometimes until dawn, and nobody asked, nobody commented. In Mexico back then, open secrets were respected. El Indio never stopped loving her, even when he married other women, even when he had children with other women. Dolores was his obsession, and in her own way she cared for him too. Maybe not with the same intensity, not with the same madness, but enough to keep visiting him decade after decade. There's a story that shows El Indio's devotion to Dolores. Once, instead of sending roses like any normal man, he sent her a box with 12 living fireflies. Imagine it. Dolores opening an elegant box, and instead of flowers, 12 blinking points of light, 12 tiny stars shining only for her. That was El Indio. Excessive, theatrical, incapable of doing anything normal when he could do something extraordinary. Dolores also shaped who he became. Before he really knew her, he was rough-aw revolutionary, a soldier turned actor. But she polished him, took him to meet Diego Rivera, introduced him to Mexico's intellectual circles, presented him to Salvador Novo, the sharpest, most biting poet of his generation. She taught him how to dress. Before Dolores, El Indio wore whatever. After Dolores, he started wearing double-breasted suits, tailored clothes, anything to impress her, anything to be worthy of her. That relationship lasted in one form or another his whole life. Dolores died in 1983, 3 years before he did, and people say El Indio never recovered from that loss. But before Dolores, before Columba, before all the rest, there was another obsession. Adela grew up in the fortress surrounded by movie stars, famous painters, music and art, but also surrounded by something darker. And here comes the first promise I made you. Decades later, as an adult, as a respected writer, Adela said it in her own words, no filter, no shame. I spent my childhood watching dozens of girlfriends and famous people parade through the house. My father ordered me to prepare his girlfriends. I bathed them and sprayed them with Chanel. She was 12 years old, and her father ordered her to prepare his lovers, bathe them, perfume them, get them ready for him. He didn't like being with them unless they'd washed and put on the perfumes he bought. A little girl, forced to be an accomplice in her father's affairs, and she obeyed. What choice did she have? At 16, Adela couldn't take it anymore. She fled the fortress. She took a Remington typewriter that had belonged to her grandfather, the Encyclopedia Britannica, and a few Durangos, nothing else. Years later, she explained her escape in words that cut. I ran from so much Mexicanness, so much Mexican realism, so much nationalism, and so much exaggerated control. They called her the captive girl of Coyoacan. To protect herself from her father, she covered her Simone de Beauvoir books with photos of Zapata and the Revolution, so he'd think she was reading Mexican history, not French feminism. But the final reason El Indio cut her out of his life was something else. Adela was a lesbian, and El Indio couldn't stand it. When she told him, he exploded. The man who claimed to love Mexico, who said he represented the best of national culture, couldn't accept that his daughter loved other women. She called him a shameless homophobe. He simply stopped recognizing her as his daughter. Adela couldn't return to the fortress until he died. Almost 30 years passed. 30 years of silence. 30 years of distance. 30 years of wounds that never healed. Maybe you know that feeling too, when someone you love rejects you for being who you are. When the person who should protect you becomes your worst enemy. Adela lived it. Meanwhile, El Indio found another woman. In 1945, at a wedding in Mexico City, he met Columba Dominguez. She was 16, beautiful, with strong Mexican features, exactly the kind of beauty El Indio celebrated in his films. He was 41, a 25-year gap. When he saw her, he said it straight, no softness. I'm going to marry you. It wasn't a proposal. It was a sentence. They married in secret because she was underage. He turned her into an actress, put her in his films, gave her the lead in Pueblerina, one of his masterpieces. He made her famous and he controlled her. He kept her barefoot and dressed like an indigenous woman, like the characters in his movies. He made her serve dinner to his friends while he bragged about his achievements. He displayed her like a trophy and kept bringing other women to the fortress. Adela, his stepdaughter, saw everything, knew everything. Years later, Adela said she didn't just prepare the lovers. She knew exactly who they were, how many there were, when they came. Columba knew too, but she endured 7 years. In 1952, pregnant with her only child with El Indio, Columba made a decision. She left him. She left the fortress carrying Jacaranda in her belly, the girl who would be born months later far from her father. El Indio fell into a deep depression. He drowned himself in alcohol for months. But when Jacaranda was born, something shifted. Even though Columba and Emilio never lived together again, they kept a strange relationship. He kept pursuing her. She kept returning whenever he needed her. A toxic cycle, repeating again and again. There's an anecdote people who knew them love to tell, a story that captures their relationship perfectly. One day, El Indio showed up drunk at the fortress with a group of friends. He asked Columba to make them mole. She cooked it quickly, almost too quickly. El Indio tasted it, loved it, bragged to his friends about his woman's cooking. After the meal, he took them out to the courtyard to show off his newest purchase, a fighting rooster that cost a fortune. The best rooster in all of Mexico, he said. The rooster was gone. Where's the red rooster? El Indio yelled. Which one? Columba asked calmly. The one in the courtyard, my fighting rooster. Oh, that one, she said. You just ate it in mole. They say that was the definitive end of the marriage. Columba got her revenge, small, symbolic, but revenge. But El Indio wasn't violent only with the women he loved. He was violent with everyone. He drank tequila like it was water. He drank until he lost control, And when he lost control, he pulled out guns because he was always armed. And here comes the second promise I made you. Chavela Vargas, the legendary singer, knew him well. Too well. One night she was having dinner at the fortress. El Indio wanted to convince her to make a movie with him. But like so many nights, he was drunk, and there was a pond with ducks in the courtyard. Suddenly, without warning, he opened a window, pulled out a pistol, and started shooting at the ducks. The other guests froze. Nobody knew what to do. Nobody dared to say anything. But Chavela wasn't just anybody. She shouted at him to stop killing the animals. El Indio turned, aimed the gun at her, and yelled, "No, and I'm going to shoot you too." Picture it, an elegant dinner, movie stars, and the host pointing a gun at a guest. Chavela went to the butler. She asked him for a weapon, any weapon, to defend herself. The butler looked at her and said, "I can't give it to you, ma'am. I know you actually would be capable of killing El Indio." And he was right. Chavela thought for a second and said a line that became famous. "Yeah, you're right. I'm not going to carry such a stupid death on my conscience. He's not worth what the bullet costs." She left the fortress that night, never spoke to him again. Decades later, in public interviews, she described him without filters. A hateful, detestable man and an abusive father. Chavela knew what she was talking about. She'd seen the monster up close. But the ducks and Chavela were just rehearsal, because El Indio's sick jealousy almost led him to commit another crime. In the 1950s, after separating from Colombia, she traveled to Europe. There she met the Spanish actor Francisco Rabal Paco Rabal. Entertainment tabloids did what tabloids do. They invented a romance. Headlines screamed, "Francisco Rabal arrives in Mexico to marry Columba Dominguez." It wasn't true, but El Indio believed it. One day in the dining area at Churubusco Studios, El Indio saw Rabal sitting at a table talking with Columba. According to screenwriter Julio Alejandro, who was there, El Indio stood up, walked toward Rabal, and was coming straight at him, ready to put 2 bullets in him. Rabal didn't understand what was happening, but someone intervened. Luis Buñuel. The Spanish director stood up and physically placed himself between El Indio and Rabal, and El Indio stopped because there were very few people on this earth he respected, very few people he wouldn't dare challenge. Luis Buñuel was one of them. Rabal lived because Buñuel stepped in. If he hadn't, we'd be telling a different story. But El Indio's violence couldn't stay contained forever. On May 30th, 1976, everything exploded. El Indio was 72. He was no longer the most famous director in Mexico. He wasn't winning awards. Nobody funded big projects for him anymore. But he refused to accept that his time was over. He wanted to remake Pueblarina, one of his masterpieces from the 1940s. He wanted to prove he could still create, that he still mattered. He was in Viesca, Coahuila, scouting locations. The same kind of town he'd filmed 100 times. Colonial churches, dusty plazas, farmers in straw hats. The Mexico he had invented. At 11 in the morning, he arrived with his small crew. He took photos of Santiago Apostol Parish, old chapels, colonial facades falling to pieces. The heat was brutal, the kind of heat that crushes you, makes you hunt for shade and drink. El Indio had a few drinks to cool off, then a few more. At 2 in the afternoon, a group of Roma Gitanos recognized him in the plaza. They couldn't believe it. Emilio Fernández, director of Maria Candelaria, the Oscar man, there in their forgotten town. They invited him to drink Turkish coffee at their camp. They were set up in an old hacienda called La Madrileña, once a locomotive factory, a ghostly place full of rusted machinery and memories of better days. El Indio accepted. He always loved being the center of attention. He always enjoyed being recognized. At 6 in the evening, he arrived at the camp. The Gitanos were thrilled. They served coffee in tiny cups, took photos with him, asked for autographs, asked about Maria Félix, Dolores del Rio, the stars they only knew from the screen. El Indio was happy. For a moment, he mattered again. For a moment, he was someone. And then a bus arrived. 3 local campesinos got off. They'd been drinking all day. They came looking for trouble. One of them was named Javier Aldecoa Robles. He was 26, young, drunk, and carrying a pistol. Aldecoa started firing into the air, shouting obscenities, insulting the Gitanos. He yelled that they were thieves, criminals, that they should get out of town, that nobody wanted them there. The Gitanos tried to calm him down, told him they were just passing through, didn't want problems. Aldecoa didn't listen, and then El Indio stepped out to defend them. A 72-year-old man confronted a drunk 26-year-old. He shouted at him to shut up, to leave them alone, that he was Emilio Fernández, the greatest director in Mexico, and he wouldn't allow some ignorant campesino to mistreat his hosts. Nobody knows exactly what happened next. The versions vary. Witnesses contradict each other. Alcohol blurred everyone's memory. What we do know, there was a fight, and Aldecoa's companions, seeing it turning ugly, took the pistol away from him to stop him from doing something stupid. But El Indio had his own gun of .45, the one he always carried, the one he'd pulled out so many times to intimidate people at his parties. He drew it, aimed at the 26-year-old campesino, and shot him twice in the chest. Javier Aldecoa fell. Blood spread across the dry ground. The Gitanos screamed. Aldecoa's companions couldn't believe what they were seeing. Someone tried to help the wounded man. They put him in a vehicle and rushed for medical care. He died soon after, on the way or at the hospital, depending on who tells it. El Indio, knowing what he'd done, fled. The news spread across Mexico like wildfire. The country's most famous director had killed a young man, shot him cold in a Roma camp while defending strangers. With help from friends, El Indio crossed into Guatemala as Coahuila police organized a manhunt. Newspapers said he escaped in his own truck, and authorities couldn't track him. Days later, in Guatemala City, he decided to turn himself in. They flew him back to Mexico. At Mexico City's airport, dozens of reporters, photographers, cameras waited. El Indio stuck to his version to the end. He had acted in self-defense. The judge didn't believe him. He was sentenced to 4 years and 6 months in prison for homicide. But Emilio Fernández wasn't just anybody. On December 10, 1976, less than 6 months after the killing, he paid bail of 150,000 pesos and walked free. People said the dead man's family changed their testimony after receiving $7,500 from the director. It was never officially confirmed, but the rumor never died. The man who had shot a 26-year-old was free before Christmas. Maybe you know that feeling too, when justice doesn't work, when money can buy everything, when the powerful always find an exit. El Indio found his, and while he negotiated his freedom, his daughter was about to fall. Here comes the third promise I made you. On November 22, 1978, Jacaranda Fernández Dominguez threw a party at her apartment. She lived in the Cuauhtémoc neighborhood of Mexico City. She was 24, studying architecture. She'd started acting in some of her father's films. She looked like she had a bright future. She lived with a friend named Lydia. The party started normal music, drinks, guests. But something happened that night. In the early hours, Jacaranda and Lydia had a serious fight. Neighbors heard shouting. Jacaranda was extremely agitated. She threw a mirror against the living room table, and then she fell from the 3rd floor. She died instantly. Police arrived, investigated, took statements, and classified her death as suicide. Columba Dominguez, her mother, never accepted it. For the next 36 years in interviews, Columba repeated the same thing again and again. She had no problems of any kind. That's why I can't explain why she did it. It's impossible that my daughter would deny life. Columba was convinced Jacaranda had been murdered. The versions of what happened that night contradict each other. Some witnesses said they saw Lydia push Jacaranda during a struggle on the balcony. Others said Jacaranda went out to the balcony alone to get away from her friend and fell because she was very drunk. 2 men who had met the women the night before at a bar were detained and questioned. They said they had accompanied them to the party, but they didn't see anything. The truth was never known. The case was closed as suicide, and that was that. El Indio was serving his sentence when he learned his daughter had died. From prison, all he could say was, "The only thing I can do for her now is pray." Columba carried that doubt for the rest of her life. 36 years asking what really happened that night. 36 years without answers. 36 years convinced her daughter had been taken from her. Maybe you also know what it's like to carry something you'll never be able to prove. Something that eats you from the inside while the world insists on explaining it differently. Something that forces you to live with doubt as a permanent companion. Columba lived with it until the day she died. El Indio got out of prison, but he was no longer the same. The genius who had invented Mexico was finished. His career as a director was definitively over. His last films as director, Mexico Norte and Erotica, both from 1979, came and went without anyone caring. Nobody wanted to finance his projects. Studios avoided him. The audience had forgotten him. Mexican cinema had changed. People no longer wanted stories of noble indigenous heroes and glorious revolutions. They wanted urban comedies, featureless movies, modern dramas. The nationalism El Indio preached had become outdated. The critics who once adored him now despised him. They said his films were artificially folkloric, that his Mexico was touristy, an exotic designed to impress foreigners more than to reflect reality. But Hollywood still remembered him. Sam Peckinpah, the director of violent, nihilistic westerns, admired him. He cast him in The Wild Bunch in 1969. El Indio played a Mexican general, a villain with layers. Exactly the kind of part Hollywood had always offered him. The dangerous Mexican, unpredictable, deadly. Peckinpah called him again for Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, and then for Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia, a dark, violent movie about a man crossing Mexico looking for a severed head. El Indio had a small but unforgettable role. John Huston, another American master, also sought him out. He cast him in The Night of the Iguana, filmed in Puerto Vallarta. El Indio played a bartender, minor work for a man who'd won the Palme d'Or, but worked nonetheless. Huston called him again in 1984 for Under the Volcano, based on Malcolm Lowry's novel. It was El Indio's second-to-last film. He also appeared in Roman Polanski's Pirates, filmed in 1986, one of his last roles. But those Hollywood jobs were crumbs compared to what he'd been. The man who once directed Maria Felix and Dolores del Rio was now taking villain roles in American movies. In Mexico, El Indio was a ghost of himself. He retreated into the fortress. He drank. He remembered better times. He stared at photos of his triumphs. He talked about Cannes like it happened yesterday. Sometimes in the mornings he would ride a horse down the median of Miguel Ángel de Quevedo, an old man on horseback in the middle of Mexico City traffic. A moving image of the past refusing to die. Neighbors watched him pass and whispered. Some recognized him. Others had no idea who that eccentric old man was, riding like he lived on a hacienda in the 19th century. El Indio lived trapped inside his own legend, inside the Mexico he had invented. A Mexico that no longer existed, maybe a Mexico that never existed. And here's a detail that sums up his romantic madness. A detail that shows you how far his obsession with impossible love went. You remember I told you he was in love with Dolores del Rio? Well, there was another woman who obsessed him just as much, maybe more. Olivia de Havilland, the actress from Gone with the Wind, sister of Joan Fontaine, one of Hollywood's biggest stars. El Indio saw her on screen in 1939 and fell hopelessly in love. He never met her in person. He sent her love letters through a friend of his, the writer Marcus Goodrich, passionate letters, where he told her about Mexico, about his home, about the castle he had built to receive her. But fate had other plans. Goodrich ended up marrying Olivia de Havilland. El Indio was devastated, but he didn't give up. He did something extraordinary. He asked President Miguel Alemán for a personal favor. He wanted a street in Coyoacán extended all the way to his mansion, and he wanted it given a special name, Dulce Olivia. The president agreed. So every morning, El Indio would open the doors to his balcony and look down at the street bearing the name of the woman he never met. He said he could breathe in the sweet scent of his sweet Olivia. He had her symbolically at his feet, turned into a street in front of his window. Forever. That street still exists today. If you go to Coyoacán, you can find it. Dulce Olivia, a monument to the impossible love of a man who never knew how to love the people closest to him. Olivia de Havilland died in July 2020 at 104 years old. She never met El Indio. She probably never knew that street existed. The Mexican government kept an eye on him. The Federal Security Directorate maintained a file on him. They spied on him, cataloged him, because a man like that belongs to no one. Not even the country he himself invented. But none of that mattered anymore. His health began to fail. He fell at his house in Acapulco and fractured his femur. They took him to a hospital where, according to Adela, He received a blood transfusion contaminated with malaria. He returned to the fortress. And there was Columba waiting for him, despite everything, despite the infidelities, the humiliations, the years apart, the death of Jacaranda. Despite everything he had done to her, she was there. On August 6, 1986, it was cold in Mexico City. Columba lit the fireplace to warm the room where El Indio was resting. Suddenly, he started to thrash, to speak incoherently, and then he shouted what would be his final words. "Get me out of here! This isn't my house!" The fortress, the castle he had built to hold his glory, the place where he'd hosted Marilyn Monroe and Maria Callas, the place where he'd filmed more than 100 movies, he no longer recognized it. He didn't know where he was. And then everything stopped. Columba tried to revive him. She pressed on his chest, but it was useless. He opened his eyes and looked at her one last time, with a sad gaze, maybe a goodbye. He took 2 breaths, and his heart stopped. Emilio El Indio Fernández died at 1:30 in the morning on August 6, 1986. He was 82. Columba dressed him one last time. She put him in his black charro suit, tied his bandana at his neck. She removed the Rolex from his wrist, the watch he never took off. At 1:55, the hearse arrived. The man who invented Mexico was dead. Newspapers published long obituaries. They remembered his triumph at Cannes, his films with Dolores Del Rio and Maria Felix, the Oscar legend, the parties at the fortress, and they also remembered the violence, the campesinos killing, the shots fired at ducks, the sick jealousy. Mexico buried one of its geniuses and one of its monsters, because El Indio was both things. He was always both things. But the story doesn't end there. El Indio died without a will. He died in Estad after 82 years of life, after 129 films, after building a cultural empire, after accumulating properties, art, and trophies of memory. He left not a single piece of paper saying what should happen to any of it. And by law, Adela became the universal heir. Adela, the daughter he had rejected for being a lesbian. The daughter who ran away at 16 with a typewriter and a stack of books. The daughter he hadn't seen in almost 30 years. The daughter he expelled from his life for being who she was. She inherited the fortress. She inherited everything. Columba Dominguez, who had stayed with him to his last second, who dressed him for death, who lit the fireplace on that cold morning, who endured decades of humiliation and abandonment, got nothing, absolutely nothing. And then a war began that still hasn't ended. Columba publicly claimed Adela wasn't even Emilio's biological daughter. She said Adela was the daughter of Fernando Fernández, El Indio's cousin, that Gladys, Adela's mother, had deceived Emilio from the start, that Adela had never been legally adopted. Adela denied it until the day she died. She said Columba was lying out of spite, out of revenge, trying to keep the fortress. The truth, like so many truths in this story, was never known. There was also another child, a son named Emilio Fernández Castañeda, born from another relationship. Very little is known about him. He lived in his father's shadow. People say Adela also stripped him of whatever inheritance he might have had. He died later under circumstances nobody wanted to investigate. And there was another daughter as well. Xochitl Fernández, born from El Indio's relationship with Gloria de la Vega. Another woman, another marriage, another daughter abandoned to her fate. The Fernández family was a disaster. Scattered children, abandoned mothers, disputed inheritances. Adela kept the fortress and devoted herself to preserving her father's memory, the same father who rejected her, the same father who threw her out of his life for loving women. In an interview shortly before she died, Adela said something that sums up her whole tragedy. "I'm still attached to my father. I love him very much. Maris Soul Warner was right. The father devoured the daughter. The father devoured the daughter." That line says everything. Adela spent her life running from El Indio and ended up dedicating her life to preserving him. She loved him and hated him. She rejected him and inherited him. She never escaped him. In August 2013, Adela died at 70, an intestinal obstruction that became complicated, painful death for a painful life. Her son, Emilio Quetzalcoatl Fernández, inherited the fortress, but Emilio Quetzalcoatl struggles with addiction, drugs, alcohol, a life that went down the drain. According to his cousin Citlali, He lives like a dead weight, incapable of taking care of himself, much less a historic mansion. And now El Indio's grandchildren fight over the inheritance literally with fists. They've had physical fights inside the fortress. Shouting, shoving, punches. Police called. Criminal complaints filed against each other. Restraining orders requested. Citlali, one of the granddaughters, spent 8 years in prison for real estate fraud. She scammed apartment buyers, was convicted, served her sentence. El Indio's blood runs in their veins, and with it, the curse runs too. The fortress. The castle El Indio built to hold his glory has become a family battlefield. The walls that once saw Marilyn Monroe now watch grandchildren fighting over money. The hallways where Maria Callas walked now host lawsuits and countersuits. In 2013, Emilio Fernandez's ashes were exhumed from Panteon Jardín, where he was originally buried. They were taken to the fortress. A special mausoleum was built for him inside the property. Next to his ashes, they placed Adela's, the father and the daughter, the one who rejected and the rejected, together forever in the house that split them apart. Columba Dominguez died on August 13, 2014. Her remains are in another cemetery, kilometers from the fortress, kilometers from El Indio, close to him in life, far from him in death. El Indio Fernández left behind 129 films, a Palme d'Or, an Oscar legend that's probably a lie, a street called Dulce Olivia, and a fortress that's falling apart while his descendants tear it to pieces. There is only one Mexico, the one I invented. He invented an entire country for the screen, and outside of it, he destroyed everyone who loved him. Because the Mexico he invented was beautiful, but the real man was a fortress. And a fortress doesn't hug you. A fortress locks you in. If you want the next one, subscribe and tell me in the comments who you want me to pull the full truth on next.